Thanks for that, Timmy. We cross live now to Squiggle McTuffins, who is in the thick of it on Wall Street as the financial ripples of the coronavirus turn into tidal waves of chaos, crashing down on stock markets around the world. Squiggle, if you can talk through your face mask, tell us what on earth is going on.
Yes, that's right, Johnny. The ASX 200 is down 216.7 points. The All Ordinaries are down 225.9 points. The FTSE 100 is down.
Squiggles, we have quite a specific audience here who like things explained to them. Just tell us what this is going to mean in simple terms.
Down. Stock prices are down.
Now we're talking. This is the sort of juicy stuff that we need from the coronavirus financial report. Give it to me straight. What does this mean as a consumer?
Well, it probably means that you are not going to be able to access any Apple products for the next 27 years.
We need a cure. Someone, won't you think of the iPhones? Hello, and welcome to episode 13 of The Pouch, the cracked wheelie bin of podcasts that aims to help the average Aussie try and make sense of their current political environment. I'm Greg. Nope, still not interested in watching a James Bond film, Savage.
And I'm Jake. We fixed it, Farwarden. On this week's episode, we talk neo-Nazis, pork barreling again, I'm so sorry, and we also talk about more pork barreling.
Well, Jake, it is Saturday, the 29th of February. Usually we record on a Sunday, but we've decided to wake up early on this beautiful Saturday morning for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, February 29th. So happy February 29th to you.
Yep. Thank you.
And
appreciate it.
It's the last day of summer, and we have had an absolute cracker of a summer. It has been a roller coaster. It has been emotional. It has been wearying, if that's a word.
No, it absolutely is a word.
Great, we'll add it in. And we just wanted to celebrate the last day of summer. You know, episode 13. I think it's a good number. And happy summer to you.
No, thank you. I'm going to celebrate today by having a barbecue, doing some mowing, drinking some beer while in a pool. Going down some water slides. What are some other summer activities?
Look, absolutely. I think just even having the old piece of tarp down the hill in your place.
True,
I think that's just a cracker of a way to spend the last day of summer. Yeah. So look at
unless it loses friction, then it's like chafe the whole way down the body.
It's all part of it. You don't have it's basically a badge of honor when you get to school or work the next day. Like, you know,
particularly when you hit the tent pegs. That's
the potholes on the way down are the worst.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Jake, this week we need to talk about neo-Nazis, apparently.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting case of potentially the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. Or more specifically, that the left wing doesn't know what the right wing is doing. So yes, ASIO Director General Mike Burgess came out of the shadows this week, and he said that in a press conference that foreign interference is at all levels greater than during the Cold War. That's a big statement.
That is a
very
big statement.
Quite literally, it's a very big statement to talk about the Cold War and then to reflect on that it's worse and more active today. That's massive.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, he's warned that a terror attack in Australia is. So they have this grading system, and probable is the I think the third highest level, and he said that it is a probable, potential occurrence with investigations doubling in the past year. He warned that right-wing extremism had come into, quote, sharp and terrible focus since the Christchurch massacre. He said that these small cells of right-wing extremists were regularly gathering to salute Nazi flags, inspect weapons, and disperse their hateful ideology. I suppose we can be slightly heartened by the fact that they're only inspecting the weapons.
Yeah. A good old weapon inspection. Is it illegal in Australia to be a Nazi?
No, it's not. It's illegal throughout Europe.
Yeah.
But not in Australia.
Now, Peter Dutton has put his foot in it in this regard. This is the bit that actually made the headline news.
It was a little bit weird. Peter Dutton quickly responded, declaring that left-wing terrorism is also a major problem that must be addressed. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that Dutton has issues telling left from right, but when pressed, he did claim that left-wing includes Islamic extremism, which is arguably one of the most forms of right-wing ideologies.
Yeah.
And while he didn't talk about it in the interview, and this is, I suppose, a bit of nuance in here. While he didn't talk about it in the interview last year, when we had all of those Extinction Rebellion protesters around the country, and we had the animal rights activists popping up, he was extremely vocal about what should be done to those individuals participating in those types of protests. So I do wonder whether he was deflecting from actual commentary about those groups, and instead talked about Islamic extremists, which I find I struggle to understand how Islamic extremists could be referred to as left wing.
Yeah, I think my theory around this is that he just misspoke, and that it was just a mistake for him to say that. I think he was trying to grapple in his mind around the point that it doesn't matter whether you're a left-wing extremist or a right-wing extremist. If you are an extremist and if you harm Australia's way of life in any way, then there will be severe consequences. And I think that he just probably just got a little bit muddled up in his head. I really don't think that he's that unbright to be talking about Islamic extremism as left wing. So I do think that it was just a bit of a mistake. That obviously his handlers have said, "This is your message. This is how you're going to say it," and he's obviously just made a little bit of a blunder. But I think ultimately the point is that and I totally agree with him on this point, in that if you are, it doesn't matter whether you're a climate activist and you're breaking the law, or if you're an Islamic extremist and you're breaking the law. If you're breaking the law, you need to get the consequences for that. Now, the people like the Extinction Rebellion, they go in knowing that they're breaking the law and that they're probably going to get a consequence for that. They believe that their message supersedes their willingness to not have a criminal record. So that's on them. But I think that's the point ultimately, is that if you are a left-wing extremist or a right-wing extremist and you're breaking the law, then there's going to be consequences for that.
I suppose there are levels of law breaking, though, and I suppose I don't want to draw a false equivalency here between left and right wing, because at least as far as I see it, left wing extremism is maybe releasing the odd animal from the pre-abattoir stage, and maybe sitting in front of a government building or preventing traffic, whereas right-wing extremism, extremism is one of those loaded terms, I suppose.
Yeah.
And extremism, in the case of that Christchurch massacre, that's I suppose the extreme part of extremism. Whereas on the left wing, I'm not sure we've seen. And maybe I'm wrong here. I am not sure that we've seen any deaths attributed to left wing extremism.
No, but there's certainly a lot of resources. Like there's certainly when you like I was in Brisbane during the whole Extinction Rebellion thing at the time, and I'm sure there'll be more.
It was bloody
of it.
inconvenient.
Yeah, well, it's not so much the inconvenience; it's also the resources, right? So if someone was one of them strapped themselves to the bottom of the Story Bridge. And that obviously held up traffic, which is inconvenient. Okay, that's fair enough. But what about the resources, the police resources that are not being used elsewhere to stop these guys from killing themselves while hanging upside down on the Story Bridge? And the same with a lot of protests. The resources that they take up. Look, I'm not saying that these people aren't right. What I'm saying is they're taking a
No,
risk.
they're left, Greg. They're left.
Aren't correct. That if you that they're choosing to break the law, and that there should be consequences, and absolutely you will get different consequences for strapping yourself to the bottom of the Story Bridge and holding up some traffic, as opposed to, I won't go into details, but some of the right wing, or Islamic extremism we've seen here in Australia. You absolutely need different consequences for that. However, the point is that, there are extremes on both sides.
Yes.
And, they need to be kept in check. But it wasn't mentioned by the left. The left wasn't mentioned by the ASIO speech. There was no mention of the left. Yeah, we need to be very clear about that.
I suppose that's maybe because on the right wing side, the consequence of extremism is potentially a massacre, as we have seen in Christchurch in very recent times, and on the left it's healthcare and social safety net I'm obviously making another false equivalency, but ASIO didn't talk about it, I suppose, mainly because it doesn't seem to be something that's on their radar. So it was, of course, interesting to see the minister chime in and say, well, actually, the left wing is also a problem. But I like the way that you put it, that it actually, perhaps the minister was trying to say that it doesn't matter what type of ideology you hold. Right. Breaking the law is breaking the law, and we will find you. And we will get you.
We will find you. Speaking of Christchurch, Jake, we had a visitor. We had a visitor from New Zealand. How exciting.
We did. The world's greatest Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, stood next to Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and they had a bit of a tete-a-tete, as it were.
Now, hang on, Jacob. If you go, I'm just going to turn my framed poster of Jacinda Ardern around while we have this conversation.
Okay.
Sorry, just give me a second.
Well, if it's okay with you, I'd just like to turn my framed picture of Scott Morrison around. Yeah. It's quite
just
heavy,
so
though.
They don't hear it. What I will do, though, I'm going to pull up my Jacinda Ardern socks. I'm going to pull them right up to my knees. There we go.
Okay. All right. Well,
they look good.
I am going to unfurl my Scott Morrison earrings.
Okay. Ooh, I can hear them dangling from here.
They are very jingly.
Now's not the time to talk about your Scott Morrison earrings.
I'm not sure that there's any good time to do that.
I think we should sell some Scott Morrison earrings on the pouch store.
We should. Somebody should. But it should be us, actually.
Now, you were saying they had a potato cake?
But they had a potato cake, otherwise known as a tete-a-tete.
Oh, tete-a-tete.
Gosh, no, that sounds highly delicious, a potato cake.
I think you have like a dictionary of oldie time words.
Old terminology. Yes, these two rubes.
Well, there were some ructions in the tete-a-tete.
They were duking it out. But so the interesting thing here is Jacinda Ardern has stepped up pressure on Scott Morrison, on the Australian impetus to extradite criminals who were born in other countries, and has publicly, I suppose, it's an interesting one. I feel that there was a bit of public shaming going on, but to the face of the Prime Minister, because the two of them were standing in Sydney Harbour, next to each other, with Jacinda Ardern saying, look, sure, it's you're not breaking the law by sending New Zealanders who were born in New Zealand but have spent most of their life in Australia and have committed a crime against the Australian legal system. It's not illegal to send them back to New Zealand. But Scott, is it really the right thing to do?
Yeah, at first I was on Scott's side, right? So I was sitting there going, yeah, you send those criminals back. Like so the idea here obviously is that if you're a New Zealander who's come to Australia and you consider yourself Australian and then you commit a crime, you're going back home. After you've done your time, you're going back home. And I was listening to Scott and I'm going, yeah, you send those criminals back home. We don't want any criminals here in Australia. And then Jacinda said, but they've got no network. So you're sending them back, but they've got no network. They're bound to reoffend. They've got, like they're not. There's no one there to greet them at the airport. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that was the idea. And I started to go, oh man, now I feel bad for these criminal people. Like I don't want them to reoffend. I want to live in a just society where they've done their time and now that's it. You're sort of forgiven. It is a bit of a like a second punishment. I sort of live by the idea that once you've done your time, that's it. Like you've served your, what is it? Like you've paid your dues to society.
Yeah.
And then we're going to put you on a plane and send you back home to a place where you're not, you don't have a network, to use her words. So I was one of those moments where I was like, yeah, go Scott. Oh man, Jacinda, you've come out with this logical thing and now I have feelings and I don't know,
Yeah, look, it is an interesting one.
I started to wear my Jacinda Ardern mittens around,
It's an interesting one because it's a compelling argument. Should they, given that they have committed a crime in this country but were not born here, should they go back to New Zealand where they have no network at all, or should they be allowed to stay in Australia where we only have the national broadband network, which is not that compelling of a network, frankly.
Speak for yourself. I don't know.
Still waiting.
Yeah.
Still waiting.
Anyway,
but it is a compelling argument, and Jacinda Ardern made the point. I think rather poignantly, which was essentially, don't send us your problems.
Well, and what struck me is sometimes politics can be about what wasn't mentioned, and she didn't really nail Scott Morrison to the cross around climate change, which I thought she was just going to come out, swinging with that one.
No, absolutely.
She didn't play her favourite hits, did she? She sort of came out and played the B-sides.
I suppose that's probably
and everyone
a
was
bit
like,
strategic.
I didn't even know that was an issue.
Yeah, nobody's even listened to the B-sides. Exactly. It's who even knew that the B-sides existed, really? But no, this is, I suppose, quite a strategic thing. Number one, I suppose on one hand, the Prime Minister has acknowledged, Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, has acknowledged over the recent weeks that what New Zealand has done, what New South Wales has done in their pledge to get to zero net emissions by 2050. They're all good things. They commend those governments, but essentially we don't have a policy yet. We're working towards all these things, I assume. But on Jacinda Ardern's side, she has an upcoming election, and the person that she is running against is quite a bit more conservative than she is, and they will be running tough on things like crime, as conservatives often do. And this is a major thing to the conservative side of politics, that Australia is essentially exporting, quote, their problems.
That's interesting that you brought up the point about it being strategic from Jacinda Ardern's point, because she's still a politician. She's still got to play the game. She's still got to win votes. She's still got to win. Parts of her country would be divided, no doubt, and she's still got to win those votes from the other side as well. So interesting that you've brought up the fact that this is a strategic move on her part to be talking about criminality, etc., etc. Speaking of criminality, Jake.
Yeah, the strategic criminality.
Unions.
Yes. Masterful segue.
We're going to ruffle some feathers this week, aren't we? Unions and employees join forces to oppose Religious Freedom Bill.
The Religious Freedom Bill is out for consultation at the moment for the second time after major revisions. And these two groups, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU, and the Australian Industry Group, they've sent this letter to Attorney General Christian Porter saying that while they support protections against religious discrimination, that the government's bill, the Religious Freedom Bill, is, quote, confusing, inappropriate, and unfair. Those are fighting words, frankly.
Yeah.
In the letter, it says, quote, most concerningly, the bill presents a risk of harm to the staff and customers of Australian businesses. Now, specifically what they've called for is that the so-called Israel Folau clause that is protecting the right to make, quote, statements of religious belief and faith to be removed from the bill. Essentially, they're concerned that this provision will conflict with general obligations under workplace laws to take reasonable steps, essentially, to provide safe and cohesive workplaces that might be compromised by overtly religious statements of faith of one or more employees within an organisation. And of course, not to mention, there's that premise of potential reputational damage, such as that which was experienced under the Israel Folau case. Now, the Attorney General Christian Porter responded, essentially rebuking the objections, saying that while the bill, quote, does impose some limitations on businesses, it does not confer a positive right to discriminate.
Right. So what does that mean for me? I run a small business. I sell Jacinda Ardern hats. What does that mean for me?
And Scott Morrison earrings, yes.
What does that mean for me as an employer? What do I got to be careful of?
Well, I suppose you are so your employees are allowed to make statements of faith.
Yes.
They're not allowed to, however, discriminate against, for example, your customers on the basis of that faith.
Right.
So there's to some extent, and I suppose the fact that that these two peak bodies have written this letter, it suggests that the wording in the Act is not sufficient to, I suppose, assuage their feelings of worry and consternation. But nonetheless, it is an interesting case that the Attorney General says, "Hey, we got it covered in the wording, guys, that you're safe." But this is the interesting thing. Back 100 years ago when I started gainful employment, particularly in an office environment, it was made very clear to me there are three things that you never discuss in the workplace.
Yes.
Religion, sex, and politics.
Yes.
That's it. You don't discuss them because someone will be offended by something. You will create a ruckus. You'll create division. You'll create consternation, and productivity will be, will suffer as a consequence.
Right.
And cohesion, of course, will suffer as a consequence.
Perhaps that's why my productivity levels have gone down over the last few years.
Been
I got to write that down.
Talking too much about politics.
Yeah, I got to write that down. Now, Jake, I went for a run the other day, and around here in the Blue Mountains, trying to find the NBN somewhere. They did say it was going to be here in February. They've got a few hours left up their sleeve. And I was going for a run, and I could, when you go for a run, sometimes you smell these beautiful smells wafting from houses. And I was running along, and I thought, is that pork barreling? Is that pork barreling? And I thought, man, there's people still are interested in this pork barreling situation. So I went and knocked on the door, and they said, come in. And what do you think they wanted to talk to me about, Jake?
So look, it was very interesting this week with some fresh news. I suppose this isn't necessarily fresh news in that it was discussed in the Australian National Audit Office report on the so-called sports rort scheme. But it was an interesting case this week that the media is trying to again implicate the Prime Minister Scott Morrison within this whole sports rorts affair. So Scott Morrison was accused this week after it emerged that 136 emails about the scheme were sent between his office and the minister responsible at the time, Bridget McKenzie.
Now, actually, hang on. That sounds like a lot of emails, but being a government employee,
yes,
probably that's just like Wednesday.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I was going to raise at the end of that. Of that, that was literally my punchline. But frankly, it's not at all uncommon that, particularly because this was a commitment under an upcoming election. Actually, you might need to remove that because I think this scheme predated the election commitment. You might need to remove that. Yep. But anyway, yes, the Australian National Audit Office told the Senate during a Senate inquiry this week of the emails sent between the Prime Minister's office and key staff within the former Sports Minister's office. Senator McKenzie also sent a list of grants that she intended to approve to Mr. Morrison on the day before last year's federal election was called.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, Scott Morrison has insisted that his office had no decision-making role in the scheme. Quote, we passed on information about other funding options or programs relevant to project proposals, and we provided information based on representations made to us.
Yeah, it doesn't look good, does it? I think, part of me just wishes that Scott Morrison would just sort of almost, quote, be honest, unquote, about this. I feel like, I don't know, man. I hope for our sake over the next couple of years that this that this pork barreling thing doesn't end up being his undoing. But when I was listening to Anthony Albanese talking about the dates. So there's some controversy around the dates that it was signed, that the dates that they approved. There's some possibility that Bridget McKenzie, I think they were kind of hinting that she was committing fraud by backdating a signature or something. Maybe you can clarify that for me. But yeah, it seems like there's confusion about the dates. There's confusion about, timelines. It's getting heavy. And I sort of almost wish that Scott Morrison would just go, yep, you know what? This is exactly how it went down. It's part of politics. I get the feeling at some stage he's going to play the trump card in that regard. He's going to go, yep, absolutely. I had a phone call with Ukraine. Absolutely. We've dangled that in front of him. And absolutely, this is just politics. And if you think anyone else is going to do...
It was a perfect sports grant, It was a perfect sports grant.
That took us a long time to get to that one, didn't it? Yes. There was a perfect sports grant. It was a perfect emails. I got 136 perfect emails. They were perfect. Jake, while we're snug as a bug, as a rug, in the proverbial pouch, this week with my fellow pouchers, as we've decided to call them, I'd like to discuss the Order of Australia. So I'll let you go. Tell me a little bit about the Order of Australia and what that means and how do I get it?
The Order of Australia is an honorary title, essentially, that was established in 1975, replacing the old Knights and Dames honour that was given every year on Australia Day. So the award recognises Australian citizens and other persons for achievements or for meritorious service.
Right.
Now, there are several levels associated with the Australia Day honours, and you may have noticed these if you've ever been emailed by, or you get on a group email, you see at the bottom of a political letter that gets sent out before every election, you might see the acronym that follows somebody who has an Order of Australia. So
but you're making the presumption that people actually read those letters. It's lovely that you're doing Australia's work for us there. We might read a couple out on air just to save people the hassle.
Next federal, state or council election, I will read every single... No, I'm joking.
I received an Australia Day award once. I got Youth Citizen of the Year for the Johnston Shire Council.
That's fantastic.
When I lived in Innisfail. Yeah. So anyway, I'm going to put that on my email address, my email signature.
You should.
From now on. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so carry on. Okay.
With these acronyms, there is a level. So the highest level is Companion, or AC. The second level is the Officer, or AO. There's the Member, the third level, AM. And there's the lowest of the low of the greatest meritorious service is the medal recipient, which is an OAM.
Okay.
Now, Bettina Arndt, she received an Order of Australia, an AM member, and she's an Australian writer and commentator who made a career writing about sex and gender issues since the 70s, essentially.
Okay. What's her gist? What's her gist? Like, what's her elevator pitch, do you think?
Well, look, certainly in the distant past, back in the 70s when she was, she was a very active person writing about sex publicly. She was one of Australia's first, public sex advocates. And that's, to be clear, she wasn't advocating for public sex. She was advocating for people to talk more openly and honestly about sex. But look, in the last 2 decades, she's opposed feminism and attracted a tremendous amount of controversy with her social commentary and her views on sexual abuse, domestic violence, and men's rights advocacy. In many ways, and maybe this is a big call, but in many ways, she resembles a bit of a public contrarian. Might even be, maybe this is a big call too, but she might even be a sort of Australia's version of that person, Milo Yiannopoulos. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Sort of Jordan Peterson type guy.
So someone who you might you go down a bit of a rabbit hole with her views, right? And you sort of start, maybe at some point you're listening to these views and you're going, hang on, this is a bit wrong, but then you go, hang on, maybe this is a bit right. Now, I'm not saying that she is right, but maybe that's what happens in your thought process, because sometimes you listen to these contrary figures and you start to go, hang on, I sort of agree with a little bit of what they're saying, and maybe it's not too contrary. Is that the sort of figure she is?
To some extent, I would say, probably to some extent. There is the example, and I think she's come out since and apologised for this, or at least said she would do it again, but probably differently. But she has tried to garner support last year in a YouTube video interview with a pedophile teacher. And during that interview, she tried to essentially garner sympathy for that teacher, referring to the victim as a provocateur, as being provocative.
Right. Interesting move. Okay. So all right. So she was already pretty divisive before getting this award. Yes. And now what's happened? What are sort of some of the repercussions of this?
Well, this week in Parliament, symbolically, Parliament voted to strip Bettina Arndt of her Order of Australia honour because she called for police to keep, quote, an open mind on whether, in recent weeks there was this awful story of the Brisbane killer, Rowan Baxter, who murdered his children and wife, and Bettina Arndt congratulated the police officer who, in a very broad and long statement, asked whether, or essentially said, we're keeping an open mind. Is this a case of a person driven too far? In part of a fairly long statement.
All right, so she sort of sympathised with that view at the time. Yep. Okay.
Exactly. So. The vote on the motion that was raised to strip Bettina Arndt of her honours was backed by the Coalition and Labor Party in the Senate, securing an emphatic 55 votes. And it follows several days of Liberal MPs coming out to condemn Miss Arndt's remarks. The motion, the interesting thing here is that the motion here in the Senate noted that the statements of Miss Arndt quote, have the potential to bring the Order of Australia instituted by Her Majesty the Queen into disrepute. And quote, the Order of Australia awards are a privilege and an honour and come with responsibilities. Quote, Miss Arndt's comments are reckless and abhorrent. The views that underpin her views on this horrific family violence incident are not consistent with her retaining her Order of Australia.
Yeah, and she would be the first person, I understand, to be stripped of the Order of Australia.
Well, no, there have been a number of people.
Sorry, let me clarify. she wouldn't be the first person stripped.
You've taken me out of context here.
Yeah. Let the record show that I said wouldn't.
So yes, plenty of people have had their Order of Australia revoked in the past, but normally it's when the recipient commits a crime, which, Bettina Arndt has not done.
No. So it would be stripped based on opinion in that regard.
Well, essentially, yes.
Yeah, right.
But in saying that, I'm not sure how, actually meritorious recipients, and maybe that's a big call, but I'm not sure how other recipients feel about having a professional provocateur in their same level. I mean, does it cheapen the honour of having an Order of Australia?
Good question. I suppose. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Jake. I don't. It's a weird thing because they could have chosen like someone a bit less controversial, couldn't they? I mean, surely someone gave them the memo saying, Bettina's a bit of a edgy catch, an edgy nomination.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Surely there's someone feeding the homeless every day who you could have just given that to, and they go, yeah, that's great.
And essentially, there are recipients of the Order of Australia who are exactly like that, who do feed the homeless and remove brain tumours and who fix eyes. But there are those recipients. But I suppose every recipient of the Order of Australia goes through a fairly rigorous selection process, and every single potential or nominee, every single potential nominee or potential recipient rather, has an entire dossier that's compiled on that individual. That essentially is they compile that dossier in order to vet the people, in order to ensure that they are a meritorious recipient, that they are not going to bring the Order of Australia into disrepute, and that essentially Australia is happy, or the Prime Minister or this peak selection body is comfortable in nominating this person based on their breadth of what they've done across their career.
All right. Well, maybe this is something to look a bit more into, and maybe it's a case of the the loud minority getting more attention than the silent majority. So we'll have to see.
Yes,
I just invented that. You can keep that one.
The loud minority versus the silent majority.
Yeah, maybe that's the case. I don't know. Something to look into. I'm sure someone out there has a very strong opinion and is yelling at their iPod player at the moment. So our apologies to that person.
Who still has an iPod. I mean, seriously.
That's right. And just
time to move to an iPhone. Well, maybe Greg, we can ask our listeners, does the fact that Bettina Arndt, arguably a professional provocateur, does the fact that she has an Order of Australia and is now in the same category as people who have saved people through removal of brain tumours, or who have fixed blindness in hundreds of individuals, or who have played tennis good like Ash Barty, and become essentially
Did Ash Barty get one?
A role model. She did, yeah. She was the youth recipient. She was.
I did see that.
And that's on the premise that essentially she has played several sports.
Yeah.
She's been a role model for young people, young girls especially, as part of that sport. So it makes a lot of sense. But I suppose the question to the listeners is, does it cheapen the honour by having this professional provocateur?
What's the other view? Like, she obviously got it for a reason. So what's the other view as well? Like, are there people out there who actually think, no, she deserves to keep it and should keep it because of X, X, and Y? I'd be interested to know about that.
Yeah. What are those X's and what are the Y's?
Yes, let's find out the X's and the Y's. Jake, I owe my friend an apology. He listens to this podcast while he's mowing the yard, and he said, since we've gone a little bit longer, the podcast doesn't finish in time with him mowing the yard. So, Bede, I'm very sorry about that.
My comment to Bede is to get a bigger yard.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I was going to suggest, right? Just wait a bit longer before, for your yard to get at least eye level, and then just binge 3 or 4 episodes. So, anyway, that's some feedback regarding some of the longer format. I apologize to my friend Bede. Jake, thank you so much for chatting to me today. What do you want from our listeners? You've sucked the life out of me. What do you want from the listeners?
Well, Greg, I want people to hit the gosh darn subscribe button on their podcast player of choice. Provide us with a rating and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and the Facebook. The Facebook, exactly. By searching for, quote, The Pouch, the podcast, end quote.
Yes, and if you have some friends, you're very, very lucky, right? Speaking of the silent majority, if you have some friends and you'd like to share the love with them, get them to go to thepouchthepodcast.com. We still haven't got a review. We begged and pleaded for a written review last week and that we would read you out, but we still haven't got one. Jump onto iTunes and whatever thing they call it now, Apple Podcasts, and write us a review. Bede, if you're out there, write us a review about how you wish that it was a bit shorter so that you could listen to this mowing. You could listen to us and finish your mowing at the same time. And, I think that that'll be great. Jake, so much. Thank you so much for talking to me this week.
Pleasure. There are different orders. There is the Order of Australia Companion, which is the highest level.
Handed out mainly to canines.
Yes. Companions, yeah. Exactly. There's the Order of Australia Officer, or AO, second highest. There's the Order of Australia Member, which is AM, and the lowest of IM. Yeah, exactly.
I'm laughing at the word member, and it's not good. Can you start that again and just start? I'm honestly laughing at the word member.